Okay, I'm Rick Fleeter, and I'm going to talk first about Microspace, basically what it is. And to talk about what it is, fairly big topic, so I'm going to break it into two parts. One that maybe is more on an engineering level is sort of what it is from an engineering point of view. What makes Microspace a little bit different from other kinds of space in terms of the engineering. And then the second part is what's different about Microspace in terms of what you can do with it compared to other kinds of engineering. And I call the presentation Crossing the Chasm, and I have this nice picture of this crazy guy in college who actually made the leap that you're looking at on this view graph, because we're very resistant to changing the things that we've gotten really, really comfortable with. And making that change is a leap. And convincing clients who use satellites to do different missions in different ways is another leap. And this has been the challenge. I've been in Microspace since the 70s. And okay, we solve a lot of technical problems, but we haven't really solved these other problems of how to make people comfortable with a different way of building satellites and how to make people interested in using satellites, using space in a different way. So those are the two things I'm going to try to cover in a whole lot of slides, in about 45 slides. So we'll just go right on. I have a little collage here with no words of just all the various things I've done. And it's a big confusion of big satellites, little satellites, books written on small satellites. But basically the messages are, first of all, I've been in a campaign to realize the promise of Microspace since the late 70s. But the other thing about it is, if you read my resume, I have like an incredible number of satellites built on my resume. And people who work on big satellites think, well, how is that possible? One human lifetime, and he doesn't look all that old and has already built 20, 22, 24 satellites. That's part of the wonderful thing about small satellites. You can build a lot of them. Because you build one in a year or 9 months or 15 months, it's over with. And you go on to the next one. It's much closer to the technological model that we're used to with computers, with smartphones, with everything that we own, with cars. We don't take 20 years to order a car. You get the car and you use it, and after 2 years, 3 years, if you keep a car 10 years, people think you're incredible, right? So, but if you build a satellite in less than 17 years, people think that's incredible. The time scale is totally out of sync. And you don't really have to be a Superman to do 24 satellites in 30 or 40 years in the business, because that's the normal pace of the technology. It's one of the ways that Microspace is completely different than conventional large space. Okay, backing way up away from satellites at all, and just thinking, what's our basic goal as aerospace engineers? We're trying to do things for people in space, and not for astrophysicists, not for Department of Defense people, not for weather forecasters, for anybody who has something to do in space. We're the people who have the keys to enable people to do whatever they want to do in space. So we're the ones who are responsible for why can't they do what they want to do, or why is it so hard, or why is it so expensive. That's the real challenge of engineering. If someone hands you an unlimited amount of money that you can lose or use at your will, okay, that's an interesting engineering problem, but it's not practical, because engineering is the science of making things practical, make them work. And one of the constraints is if it costs a semi-infinite amount of money, it's really not going to help the world, because it's very nice you can do that, but nobody can afford it, which is very close to where we are in space. More generally, what this slide says is, what determines what humanity can accomplish in space? What are the limits? I mean, just thinking philosophically, why can't we just do all kinds of crazy things? Why don't we have people living and going to hotels on the surface of the moon, on the surface of Mars, traveling? Why don't we do the things that were in the Stanley Kubrick movie based on the Arthur Clarke book of 2001? 2001 was a long time ago, and we're still not anywhere close to doing any of the things that were in that movie. So what is the limits? What are the things that make that envelope? And I made a little list. It's not very many things. It's fairly simple. The risk. We have an aversion to risk. If the government funds us in the US environment or in the ESA environment to build a satellite, they don't want it to fail. And they're going to do many, many things to keep the satellite from failing, which is very nice, but each one of those things becomes a constraint on what we can do. You have to use parts that have a certain heritage, you have to have parts that have a certain qualification level, you have to have a certain amount of redundancy, therefore the satellite has to take on a certain size, a certain mass, therefore it's going to need a certain launch vehicle, therefore it's going to have a predetermined cost, and at that cost level, we can't afford to fail. or there's people on board, so we can't afford to fail. If you can't afford to ever fail, you are limited as an engineer to what you can actually do. And the cost of testing and having that first failure is so high that it really puts a constraint on the amount of research and development we can do. Then one that's a little more embarrassing is vision. Vision is our imagination. Where do you want to go today? Thinking of new missions, thinking of using space in new ways is not that easy. And we don't want to admit that we're limited in creativity. I mean, it's a very difficult thing to say to people, but let's face it. The early days of space revolved around communications, science, and remote sensing, mostly for meteorology and defense. And people thought for 30, 40 years that those were the only things that space was good for, which is very embarrassing because then we added a fourth one called navigation with GPS. Nobody had thought of that. It took us 40 years to think about and then realize global positioning systems in space. So at one point in this talk, I'll talk about that we went from 3, the trilogy of things, to 4, having broken the limit of 3. There's 4, now there's 5, now there's 6. Now we admit to maybe 7 uses of space, where not that many years ago we thought of 3. The other problem with vision is that we, as aerospace engineers, cannot hope to conceive of all the ways that people can make space. And the analogy that I use, maybe overuse, is with the large and small computer worlds. Because when computers were only in the hands of computer scientists and other kinds of scientists, which is when I got started using large mainframe computers, we only conceived of computers as tools to do very sophisticated scientific, technological, and some business applications. I mean, IBM was started mainly to do accounting for very large companies, and that was why it was called International Business Machines. So it wasn't until computers were put in the hands of normal people who weren't scientists, who weren't the managers of large businesses, and who weren't computer scientists, that we invented all of the uses of computers that we have today that are predominant now in the uses of computers, such as Facebook. Facebook is a huge application of computers. Smartphones are really computers. Everything you do with your smartphone was not mostly conceived by IBM. It was conceived by people who started using these things and discovered that they wanted SMS, that they wanted WhatsApp, that they wanted FaceTime, that they wanted Leaf Snapper, which is a program, an app that you can take a picture of a leaf and it will find for you what kind of tree did that leaf come from, where does that tree grow, and so on. Those are not things that a computer scientist would even know anything about. We are limited in vision until we put the satellites in the hands of normal people who live on normal budgets in what I call Earth time, meaning they're not going to wait 20 years to do something. If you're going to do a hobby, you're going to do a game, you want to do it like tomorrow or next week, or maybe you'll plan a vacation for 6 months from now, but not 20 years from now. The technology, of course, we always focus on that because we are engineers. We think we're limited by the technology, and we are somewhat limited by the technology. How much power, how much aperture, in the small satellite case particularly, to collect solar energy, to do high resolution imaging. Those things are fairly obvious to us, and maybe we're overly fixated on technology rather than face the fact that we're limited by our vision, which is limited by the smallness of the population that we serve. And then transportation. The fact that we have to launch into space on a very, very hostile environment means that even though the satellite lives in zero gravity, it has to be built extremely ruggedly. It's one of the advantages of small satellites that when you make a structure that's only 10 or 20 centimeters in characteristic dimension, it's much easier to make it very stiff. But classically, in large conventional space systems, the building of the structure was a major challenge. And then once you built that large gossamer structure, managing the heat transfer across that structure with one side facing space, one side facing the sun, became a huge problem. So in general, the transportation I'll talk about shapes the mission, and we don't even realize how much we're constrained by what the transportation does for us. And then one that is hardly thought of is management. When missions become very, very large, the management structure becomes the limiter. We can't have all the engineering flexibility we want to use a different processor, to use a different material. Oh, this thing just came on the market. I could save 10 watts. I could save 10 kilograms, but you can't use it. And why can't you use it? Because we don't know what the system's implications are to the 9,999 other people working on the program, one of whom may have a problem with making that change. And there's no way to manage that information flow. So the management of the program becomes an engineering constraint, besides the fact that it becomes very expensive. Little companies are more efficient than big companies. And the reason for that is they have less management overhead. Everybody's working, right? Whereas when you end up with 100 people, as I did in my company, you have to spend most of your time managing those 100 people. It's a daunting job, and it costs money, and it's not their fault. Management has a cost involved to it. So risk, vision, technology, transportation, and management. Those are the risks. Those are the limits. Those are our personal limits, or our limits because of our marketplace, or because of our technology, which really includes the transportation, that limits what we can accomplish in space. And so if we want to look at where do we want to penetrate, it's those things we have to penetrate. So most aerospace engineers focus on the technology. We just need a faster processor. We just need 1% more efficiency in solar panels. We just need a propellant with 10, 20, 30 seconds more ISP. And we think that we're going to solve the world's problems with technology. But the history of that kind of thinking is pretty limited, really. And while I was on my way here to Bulgaria, I read a nice article in the In-Flight magazine on the history of the bicycle, wherein they said, look, the bicycle technology has been pretty good since 1899, and there's some double the number of bicycles in the world that there are cars, and yet nobody uses them for actual transportation. And why is that? And they said, look, it's not because the technology isn't good enough. Technology is really amazing for a bicycle, but it's people's attitudes. And it's what they think of to do, and it's how the infrastructure works. If you want to ride your bicycle to work, are there bike lanes? You're going to be hit by a car? Is it, what's the situation that the bicycle is being used in? So a total focus on technology is not going to solve our problem. And if there were no better kind of argument for that, it's that we've been working on the damn technology since 1957. And when are we going to finally say it's good enough to do something useful to most people in space? The next slide is really waypoints, which is, okay, what am I going to talk about? Why do we even care about microspace? Why, have I spent my whole life trying to realize this goal of making space smaller? And then what is microspace, right? What's different about it? When I left my job in the conventional space world to do little satellites, people were convinced there was nothing there. What's the advantage? What's different about it other than that they're very small, so they can't do very much? Okay, then something I call, where do you want to go today? What's our vision? And how does your vision change when your technology changes? You see the world differently when you're using a different technology. The next topic is this idea of applications. Are there only 3 applications of space, or are there 4 applications of space, 5, 6, maybe 7 applications of space? We really don't know. You don't know what you don't know. All we know is that we used to think there were 3, and then we thought there were 4, and then we thought there were 5. And I think there are many, many out there, and we're not finding them. And then reliability. Why did I pick out reliability? Because reliability is, by most engineers who I teach in the university environment, and most engineers who I consult to in the industrial environment, and by most engineers who I worked with when I was working in the industrial environment and running a company, not really considered engineering. So what is it? The why Microspace won. Okay, you can kind of jokingly say, well, it's just a trend, right? First there was the Big Bang, right? Space was very small, had a dimension nearly 0. Then we had all the planets. The planets are basically satellites of their suns, right? And they're very large. And then the very first satellites, Sputnik, were actually very small. And then they became very large again, in our human scale anyway, with the space shuttle and the Saturn V rocket and Apollo and the gigantic robots that the Soviet Union put on the surface of Mars that weighed thousands of kilograms. And then all of a sudden, small satellites became fashionable again. And so is it just a fashion, or what's going on in space? And okay, this seems like a little bit of a non-topic for an engineering talk, but the point of it is that when a technology matures, the consumer has choices. And this is something that our marketplace has not realized. Being involved in microspace does not mean that I think that there's no role for big satellites. And I don't think that large satellite, large space, or human space people need to think that there's no role. We went through this in the bicycle world. First, there were only road bikes. Then at some point, some people in California invented the mountain bike, and then there became this war. There were mountain bike magazines, road bike magazines. Roadies didn't like the guys who were on mountain bikes. Now there's been a fusion, and there are all kinds of products that are urban bicycles, mountain bicycles, enduro bicycles. There are bicycles, folding bicycles in every form you can imagine, because we finally got over, is it a big satellite or is it a small satellite? When you buy a car, you can get a smart car with 2 seats, you can get an Audi with 9 seats, you can get a semi-tractor trailer that'll haul thousands of kilograms across highways over thousands of kilometers, and that's your choice because the technology is mature. The original automobile, the Henry Ford type automobile, came in one model, and you either got that model or you didn't. After 50, 60 years in space, we need to get over the idea that it's this or it's that and offer consumers a wider range of choice. The second problem, let's say, with microspace, or the second why of why we needed microspace, is just a very basic logic that we were living with relatively small satellites, satellites of 10 kilograms or 100 kilograms in the 60s, when the weight of a megabyte of memory, to take a mass measure of the capability that we had in digital systems, was about 10 kilograms. In other words, the total mass of the satellite would have had to have been dedicated to carry a megabyte into space. Now a megabyte is so light you really can't assign a weight to it. I mean, it's a gram, it's a microgram, it's a milligram, we don't care. A megabit of memory, a megabyte of memory is not really a mass constraint for anybody in the world. You can take a megabyte of memory and put it on a bird's foot and the bird wouldn't notice that it's there. So electronics has decreased in size by 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 orders of magnitude. And what have satellites done in the meantime? They've increased in size by 3, 4 orders of magnitude. What's the logic of that? How come as the technology got smaller, the satellites didn't get smaller? So I was thinking in the 80s, I was thinking, gee, if we could do something useful with 100 kilograms in 1980, in 1990, when the electronics had shrunk by a factor of 100, how come we can't do something useful in 1 kilogram? And it was this kind of thinking that led Bob Twiggs to suggest the CubeSat, 1 kilogram, 10, because really in the epoch that the CubeSat was invented, maybe 10 years after that, you could fit virtually an unlimited amount of electronics into that package that we couldn't have put in a satellite of 1,000 kilograms before. And yet the odd thing was, there was no building of small satellites despite this huge miniature. Everything else got smaller. Cameras got smaller, telephones got smaller, radios got smaller. Many things got so small that we had to make them bigger again just for the human interface, right? But the basic technological size of these things could be incredibly small. Meanwhile, the satellites were getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So it didn't seem to be logical. And then the third reason for microspace is that the world has accelerated. The world, let's just talk about our clients in the science world. The science world, it's very difficult to pose a question today being 2014, that is still going to be relevant in 2034. I mean, when you think about that, most of the problems that we have today are going to be solved before 2034. So it already happens to us quite frequently that by the time the satellite is about to be launched, why do we even bother? The problem has already been solved on the ground. We launch it because with all that investment behind it, we might as well see whether the thing works or not. I mean, it'd be really a disappointment to spend $1 billion on a satellite and then not launch it, because the basic physics problem that it's addressing has already been solved. So we limit ourselves in missions to those questions we're pretty sure we can't resolve any other way, even in 20 years. And that is, how many problems are like that? I mean, I'm not smart enough to think of any problems that are that difficult that I can be sure society won't solve them in 20 years. But 20 years is the life cycle of major missions. So major missions are limited to very classical science problems that are not very easily solved. And so what about the rest of us? What about the rest of us who live in a technology world? We need an answer tomorrow. We need an answer by the end of the fiscal year so that we can determine how our process is going to be better than our competitors' process next year. Well, how does space fit into a product life cycle that's typical of technology product life cycles of 6 months to a year to 2 years to even 3 years, which is already very long for a product life cycle. So this ability to turn things around faster is something you cannot do. And last night when I was speaking on Microspace, one of the people in the audience asked me about responsive space, which, okay, it was a military concept, but really, if a war breaks out, you don't have 20 years to decide you want to launch a satellite to see what the enemy is doing. You need that satellite like right now, like tomorrow morning. And there's no way to build a satellite that weighs 5,000 kilograms by tomorrow morning. But you can, in fact, and we have demonstrated that you can have a satellite ready to launch in an hour or two in the small satellite world. So this ability to do speed is an important element. And The other thing that I would say about small satellites has to do with the cost. Cost is not a great way to promote your product. If the product doesn't have utility, people don't want it at any cost. But on the other hand, cost matters because whereas the US government could set aside a certain number of billions of dollars to land on the moon in Apollo, we don't do it now. And people are saying, well, gee, why don't we have the enthusiasm for space that we had then? Well, you could say because we already did it. But there's another reason, which is there's many more competing technologies now. There is medical imaging. In the medical world of the 1950s, there was no way you could spend $1 million diagnosing and treating a cancer patient. All those diagnoses, all those treatments didn't exist. When space got started, the interstate highway system was relatively new and we hadn't made this huge investment. There was no internet. All of these things compete for government money, and so the pie, the slice of the economical pie dedicated to space has to shrink because the world is much more complicated now than it was in 1957 when Sputnik was launched. And we have to get used to that. We're not going back to the Apollo era. We're not going to be taking 1% of the United States GMP and spending it on space anymore because that technology slice is going to many more users. So that's another reason why space, to be responsive, not in time, but in budget, we have to be able to do our missions for less than we used to do them for. The next slide has a laundry list of reasons. And many of these reasons I've now talked about. One is that you bring a lot of new people into space, and you bring a lot of young people into space, and those people suggest things that us old space people have already convinced ourselves are not addressable anymore. And they address those things. Why was it that Apple became an audio company when Sony was the dominant audio company? Sony knew everything about audio. They were the kings of audio and also television at that time. And yet it was Apple that brought out the iPod. And what was so special about the iPod? The iPod had a hard disk in it, a very small 1-inch drive hard disk. Sony had basically convinced itself that that was not a practical technology for what they called at the time their Walkman, their music players. And what Sony had done instead was they had developed a much more larger, much more what they thought robust product, which is the mini disc. And the mini disc was where Sony was locked in. And Apple was more familiar with hard disks, and the feeling in those days, none of us hardly remember what that was that if you shook a hard disk, it would skip. And the magic of the mini disc was you could shake it, you could take it running, you could drop it, you could put it on the seat of your car, you could put it on the dashboard of your car, vibrating, vibrating, vibrating. Mini disc was unflappable. But in fact, hard disk technology had come along and the cost per megabyte was relatively low, and the durability was fairly high, and the battery power was fairly low, and Apple realized, hey, we could take this modern small hard disk, put this into a handheld music player, and you would have all that flexibility of hard disk. You can erase it, you can write to it, all those sorts of things. And Apple made that innovation. If we don't put space in the hands of new people, what we're really doing is limiting ourselves to our preconceived ideas of what we can do and what we can't do. As one of the applications of space, education, very closely related to that, it matters. Because universities are not just here to teach people the same thing we taught them 40 years ago. We're trying to find new facts. We're trying to find new things. We're trying to find new ways of doing things. If the satellite world is divorced from the university world, that's another kind of an infrastructure, many, many billions, trillions of dollars that society is invested in to come up with new ideas. And the space world, by saying it's too expensive, it's too complicated, it's too formalized, and you need all these special facilities and clean rooms and secured areas and all that sort of stuff. Therefore, universities cannot participate in space. That's fine, but you've cut yourself off from $1 trillion worth of infrastructure designed to come up with new ideas. So then we look at ourselves later and we think, gee, we don't have any apps for space that's compelling countries to put large budgets or put any budget into space. I was at a talk once in Israel to the Knesset, to the Parliament of Israel, and the head of the Israeli Space Agency addressed them and said to them, I'm going to do something that no head of any space agency has ever done when he addressed his parliament. I'm not going to ask you for money. I'm not going to beg for money. Don't give me any money. Unless I'm making something you want to pay for. If you want to pay for it, then buy it from me and give me the budget to build it. But don't give it to me because it's space, because it's our destiny, because Israel needs to have a role in space. Give it to me because I'm creating utility for you that's worth the amount of money you're giving me, and don't do me any favors. And I thought, that's a really good philosophy. Don't try to sell space on a dream. Try to sell space on what you're really getting out of it. And that's where you need more ideas. You have to have the killer app that people are, I want that. I'll spend 600 euros for that smartphone because I want to be able to do the things that smartphone does instead of spending $49 for a regular cellular telephone, which works just fine, right? But you're going to spend that 600 euros 10, 15 times more because there's apps in that phone you want. And that's what we need in space. And to do that, we need more people in space.